When we speak of the empath, we are not merely describing a personality trait or a convenient label for those who feel deeply. We are speaking of an ancient wound, an archetypal pattern that emerges when the child, fragile and luminous, learns that survival depends not on authenticity but on compliance. The empath in their essence is not born from abundance but from necessity. They are the ones who learn to tune their inner instrument to the vibrations of others. To sense the storm before it broke, to anticipate anger, to soothe chaos, to become the balm for the wounds of those who should have been their protectors. And so the empath, often celebrated in modern discourse as a gift-bearer of sensitivity, is in truth the echo of the child who survived by pleasing everyone. This revelation unsettles, for it dismantles the illusion that empathy in its most extreme form is an untainted blessing. It reveals instead a haunting truth, that what we call the empath is the shadow of the abandoned child. The self split between being and appeasing. I have seen it in the dreams of countless souls, where the child stands in the corner of a vast house, watching the movements of the giants around them. Learning that to speak truth is dangerous but to please is safe. These dreams are not personal accidents. They are the symbolic map of the collective unconscious where the child archetype is both crucified and crowned. When you listen to me now, I ask you not only to reflect on your own life, but to enter into the inner theater of humanity. Each empath carries within them a story that is also your story. The story of how the psyche adapts when faced with overwhelming power. The empath is, in a sense, the diplomat of the soul, negotiating peace in the battlefield of the family. Yet beneath their skill lies sorrow, for they are always alert, always attuned, and seldom at rest. Consider how such a child learns to regulate their very existence. They sense the anger of the father before his voice rises. They intuit the sadness of the mother before tears fall. They enter rooms scanning for danger, for silence, for unspoken needs. In doing so, they disconnect from their own impulses. Repressing the wild spontaneity of childhood, they cease to ask, "What do I want?" and instead whisper, "What will keep me safe? What will keep them pleased?" This is the wound that births the empath. Not a saintly blessing but a survival strategy woven into the nervous system, etched into the unconscious. Yet the archetype of the empath is not a curse. Like all archetypes, it is ambivalent. In its shadow, it chains the soul to exhaustion, codependency, and the endless sacrifice of self. In its light, it reveals the possibility of deep compassion, the ability to heal, to perceive subtle realities. But unless the empath confronts the origin of their gift, they remain trapped in the childhood posture of pleasing everyone, mistaking their prison for purpose. Dreams show us this truth more vividly than words. I recall a dream shared with me long ago. A young woman saw herself as a child standing before a mirror, but in the reflection she appeared as a servant, bowing endlessly to invisible figures. Behind her, a great lion prowled, unseen by her reflection. Here the unconscious was revealing that beneath her role as pleaser lived a primal power, the lion of instinct and authenticity, suppressed yet restless. The empath is always such a dreamer, unaware that within them resides both the servant and the lion. The empath archetype is closely bound to the anima and animus, for the repression of true self distorts the inner marriage of opposites. When the child learns to please, the inner masculine becomes weak, unable to assert, while the inner feminine becomes hyper-attuned, over-receptive. Thus, the empath often lives as a distorted vessel, overflooded by feeling, unable to set boundaries, torn between yearning for love and fearing rejection. Their dreams overflow with water, with floods and drowning, symbolic of emotions uncontained. But the psyche does not abandon us in our distortions. It sends symbols, synchronicities, inner rebellions. Many empaths report sudden outbursts of anger, moments when the carefully maintained facade cracks and the repressed shadow bursts forth. This is not pathology. It is the self attempting to restore balance, for the empath cannot forever remain the child who pleases. Life itself demands individuation, demands that the self emerge from the prison of compliance into the authenticity of being. Why then do so many empaths resist this emergence? Because the memory of childhood is not just psychological, it is visceral. To please was to survive. To displease was to risk abandonment, punishment, shame. Thus, the empath carries a secret fear. If I stop pleasing, I will cease to exist. This fear is irrational in the present, but it is true in the memory of the body, true in the buried logic of the unconscious. And so the empath clings to their role even when it drains them, even when it destroys their relationships, even when it silences their soul. Here lies the mystical paradox. The empath must betray their childhood self in order to save their adult soul. They must cease being the child who survives by pleasing and dare to become the adult who lives by truth. This is no small task, for it requires confronting the shadow, facing the rage, grief, and terror buried beneath decades of pleasing. It requires seeing the parents not as gods but as flawed mortals, recognizing that their demands shaped a false self. It requires mourning the childhood that never was, where love was conditional and authenticity was forbidden. Do not underestimate the spiritual significance of this work. For the empath, individuation is not only psychological, it is alchemical. It is the transformation of wound into wisdom, of servitude into sovereignty. When the empath confronts their shadow, they awaken the lion that has long waited behind the mirror. They reclaim the instincts that were repressed, the boundaries that were denied, the desires that were silenced. They discover that compassion without boundaries is self-destruction. But compassion rooted in authenticity is divine. In myth, we see this pattern again and again. Consider Persephone, the maiden who was taken into the underworld. She too was the pleasing daughter, the one who obeyed, who lived in the light of her mother's garden. But she was forced into darkness, into a realm of shadow, and there, in the underworld, she became queen. This is the journey of the empath, to descend into the underworld of their own unconscious, to face the shadow of their childhood, and to rise not as a servant but as sovereign. The pleasing child must die so that the authentic soul may be reborn. This is why I say the empath is not a saint but the survivor. And survival, though noble, is not the goal of life. Life seeks wholeness, not mere safety. The empath who continues to live as the child pleaser denies their wholeness, living half a life bound to the needs of others. But the empath who dares to confront their past becomes more than a healer. They become a mystic, one who knows both the sorrow of the wound and the power of its transformation. The empath who dares to step out of the prison of pleasing is confronted first with silence. And this silence is terrifying, for the child within still expects punishment, rejection, abandonment. The silence feels like death. But slowly in that silence the authentic voice begins to emerge. It does not shout at first. It whispers. It whispers in dreams, in strange impulses, in unexpected anger, in sudden tears that seem to come from nowhere. It whispers through synchronicities, books falling from shelves, words overheard in conversation, encounters with strangers who speak truths one needed to hear. These are not accidents but the subtle language of the unconscious, guiding the empath back to themselves. In this way, the path of the empath is the path of initiation. Many of you believe you are simply cursed with sensitivity, doomed to absorb the pain of others. But what you call a curse is initiation into a deeper mystery. To feel so deeply is not merely psychological, it is mystical. You are being initiated into the capacity to hold opposites, to feel both the suffering of the world and the terror of your own wound. But unless you recognize this as initiation, you will mistake it for fate, condemning yourself to repeat the same pattern endlessly. Let me give you another image from the dream world. A man once told me he dreamed he was carrying a great bowl of water across a desert. The bowl was so heavy he feared it would break. Yet he refused to set it down. All around him the desert stretched endlessly, and he was parched with thirst, but he never drank from the bowl, for he believed it was meant for others. Do you see? This is the dream of the empath. They carry the water of life for everyone else but never drink themselves. They are parched while appearing generous. Yet the unconscious reveals that the bowl was his own to drink from, if only he dared. This is the task of the empath. To drink from their own bowl. To recognize that their sensitivity is not for the world alone but for themselves. This drinking is the first act of individuation. It is the refusal to remain the child who gains safety by serving others. It is the decision to nourish the self, to value one's own life. Without this, the empath becomes a martyr, a figure who bleeds endlessly for others while never knowing their own joy. Such martyrdom is not divine. It is pathology masquerading as holiness. The divine does not ask us to annihilate ourselves for others. It asks us to become whole so that we may give from fullness, not emptiness. The shadow of the empath is often filled with rage. This rage is the voice of the child who was never allowed to speak, who swallowed words, who smiled while bleeding. If the empath does not face this rage, it erupts unconsciously, poisoning relationships, creating cycles of resentment and passive aggression. Many empaths are horrified by their own anger, believing it betrays their image of kindness. But I tell you, this anger is sacred. It is the lion at the mirror's edge, roaring to remind you that you exist. To integrate this rage is to reclaim the fire of life. Yet integration does not mean unleashing anger indiscriminately. It means listening to it, understanding its message. Anger, when integrated, becomes boundary. It says, "Here's where I end and you begin." Without anger there can be no boundary. Without boundary there can be no self. Thus, the empath must allow their anger to speak, not as destruction but as truth. This is the alchemy of transformation. Rage becomes clarity. Fire becomes light. I tell you also that the empath archetype is intimately tied to the archetype of the wounded healer. In ancient myth, the healer is always wounded. For only those who know pain can guide others through it. But the danger lies in remaining only the wounded one, never becoming the healer. Many empaths remain bound to their wound, endlessly reliving the childhood survival strategy, mistaking it for identity. They say, "I am just sensitive. I cannot change." But the archetype calls them deeper. You are sensitive because you were wounded. But you can heal. And in healing you will become more than a pleaser. You will become a channel of authentic compassion. And compassion without authenticity is manipulation. It appears generous but hides fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of abandonment. Fear of being unloved. Authentic compassion arises only when the self is whole. When the child within has been acknowledged, comforted, and set free. Then, and only then, can the empath offer compassion that does not destroy them. Then they can say, "I see your pain, but I will not sacrifice my soul to fix it. I will walk with you, but I will not walk instead of you." The path is not easy, for the empath must walk into the labyrinth of their own psyche. The labyrinth is filled with ghosts. The accusing father, the demanding mother, the siblings whose needs overshadowed their own, the teachers who praised them only when they complied. These ghosts whisper still, "Be good. Be quiet. Please us." And each time the empath asserts themselves, the ghosts rise in protest. But remember, the labyrinth is also guarded by the Minotaur, the shadow. To face the Minotaur is to face the terror of displeasing, the terror of being rejected, the terror of being alone. Yet within the labyrinth lies the thread of Ariadne, the thread of the self that leads one out. In this sense, individuation is always a descent before it is an ascent. The empath must descend into their own underworld, confront the ghosts, face the Minotaur, and reclaim the parts of themselves that were lost in childhood. Only then can they emerge into the light, not as the pleaser but as the whole person. Do you understand now why I call this the final revelation? It is because the truth is not flattering. The empath is not born of divine blessing but of childhood survival. And survival is not the same as life. To live is to be whole, to embrace both shadow and light, to stand in truth rather than in compliance. This is the revelation that shatters illusions but sets the soul free. Even now as I speak, some of you feel resistance. You feel the voice within saying, "But my empathy is what makes me special. Without it, who am I?" This is the voice of the child clinging to the role that kept them safe. I tell you, you are more than your empathy. You are more than your ability to please. You are a soul with instincts, with desires, with fire. Your empathy is but one thread in the tapestry of your being. If you cling to it alone, you live as half a soul. If you integrate it, you live as the full self. The self, that great archetype of wholeness, does not demand that you renounce empathy. It demands that you put it in balance. The self says, "Do not destroy your gift, but do not worship it either. Place it beside your anger, beside your instinct, beside your joy, and let all stand together." For the self is not perfection, but balance. The union of opposites, the harmony of contradictions. This is why so many empaths are drawn to mysticism, to dreams, to symbols. Their sensitivity is a gateway to the numinous. But unless they confront their wound, their mysticism becomes escapism. Their spirituality becomes another form of pleasing. They pray to be loved by God as they once prayed to be loved by parents. They seek visions not for truth but for comfort. But the true mystical path is not comfort. It is transformation. It demands that you confront your shadow, that you drink from your own bowl, that you walk into your own labyrinth. Only then does spirituality become real. And when the empath does this, something extraordinary occurs. They discover that their gift is not to please but to perceive. To perceive the subtle movements of the soul, the hidden wounds of others, the symbols and dreams, the whispers of the unconscious. They become not servants but seers, not pleasers but prophets of the inner world. This is the destiny of the empath who transcends survival. I ask you to imagine now the image of a child standing at the edge of a forest. Behind them lies the house of their childhood, filled with ghosts and demands. Before them lies the forest, dark and unknown. The child trembles, for the forest is terrifying. But within the forest lies freedom. Within the forest lies the self. The empath must choose: remain in the house as the pleaser or walk into the forest as the seeker. This is the choice before each of you. The empath who steps into the forest discovers that the shadows are not enemies but teachers. Each dark figure that emerges in dream or imagination is a fragment of the self, long exiled in the name of survival. The angry child, the selfish child, the wild child. These were all locked away so that the pleasing child might remain acceptable. Yet the psyche does not forget. What is exiled returns, often in the form of projection. The empath sees selfishness in others, anger in others, wildness in others, and recoils, not realizing they are staring into the mirror of their own denied nature. Projection is the first language of the unconscious. When we cannot hold a truth within, we see it without. Thus, the empath often finds themselves surrounded by narcissists, aggressors, or takers. They say, "Why do I always attract such people?" But what they attract is the reflection of their own denied self. The aggressor mirrors their repressed anger. The narcissist mirrors their buried instinct to take. The taker mirrors their unexpressed desire to demand. Until the empath sees this, they will remain trapped in cycles of pain, believing themselves cursed when in truth they are being invited to reclaim what they lost. It is a painful awakening to realize that what we despise in others is often what we have silenced in ourselves. The empath despises the selfish one because they themselves were never allowed to be selfish. They despise the loud one because they were silenced. They despise the cold one because they were forced to be warm at all costs. But individuation demands honesty. To become whole, the empath must reclaim selfishness, loudness, coldness, not as tyrants but as aspects of balance. Without selfishness, one cannot know self-care. Without loudness, one cannot speak truth. Without coldness, one cannot set firm boundaries. Thus, the shadows that terrify the empath are the very keys to their freedom. I recall a dream from another patient, a man who always prided himself on being endlessly accommodating, endlessly kind. In his dream, he stood in a banquet hall serving food to 100 guests. But each time he placed a dish on a table, the guests devoured it greedily and demanded more. He grew thinner and weaker. Yet he continued to serve. Finally, at the far end of the hall, he saw a small boy sitting alone, starving. The boy was himself. He fell to his knees in grief. This dream revealed the truth. His serving was endless because he could not bear to feed himself. The banquet guests were projections of his own inner hunger, devouring his life force because he denied it to himself. Do you see? The empath is often devoured not by others, but by their own refusal to nourish the self. When one begins to reclaim the exiled parts, dreams shift. No longer is the child only a servant. The child begins to speak, to shout, to rage, to dance. At first, the dreamer resists, waking in fear, believing they are becoming monstrous. But this monstrosity is a shadow demanding its rightful place. The monster in the dream is not evil. It is power distorted by repression. To embrace the monster is to discover vitality. This is why, in so many myths, the hero must befriend the dragon or ride the beast. The empath must befriend their dragon, for it guards the treasure of their true self. I tell you also that the empath's wound is collective, not merely personal. In every culture, children are sacrificed to the demands of the family, of society, of tradition. Some are told, be strong. Others, be obedient. Others, be good. Each child learns to repress some part of themselves to earn belonging. The empath is simply the one whose repression took the form of pleasing. Thus, their journey is not only for themselves but for the collective. When the empath reclaims their shadow, they heal not only their own soul but also the ancestral wound of generations who lived in silence. Here is where mysticism enters. For the empath's transformation is not merely psychological. It is archetypal, cosmic. The child who pleases everyone is an image of humanity itself, longing for divine approval, fearing rejection by the gods, offering sacrifices to appease unseen powers. To awaken from this is to awaken into a new relationship with the divine, not as pleasers of a tyrant god, but as children of a living mystery, beloved for who we are, not for what we give. In this sense, the empath's healing is humanity's healing, the end of an ancient fear of abandonment by the cosmos itself. The forest path leads deeper still. Once the empath reclaims their shadow, they begin to feel a new power rising within. It is not the fragile sensitivity of the child, but the fierce sensitivity of the adult. They can feel the suffering of others without drowning in it. They can sense manipulation without being bound by it. They can say no without guilt. Yes, without fear. This is the power of the individuated empath, not the one who pleases but the one who perceives with clarity. But beware, the ego often tries to hijack this transformation. Having suffered so long, the empath may swing to the opposite extreme, becoming hardened, cold, even narcissistic themselves. This too is imbalance. The task is not to abandon empathy but to integrate it. Balance. Always balance. To hold both compassion and boundary, both sensitivity and strength, both giving and receiving. The individuated empath is not extreme but whole. And when wholeness emerges, the empath discovers joy. Not the counterfeit joy of being praised for pleasing, but the true joy of existing as oneself. For the first time they may laugh without fear of displeasing, dance without fear of judgment, rest without guilt. This joy is the sign of integration. It is the soul saying, "At last I am free." And do you feel the weight of this? It is not a small revelation. It is a final revelation. The empath, celebrated by the world as a saint, is in truth a survivor of childhood exile. Their gift is born of wound. Their sensitivity born of fear. But within that wound lies the seed of transformation, the potential for wholeness. If they dare to face the shadow, if they dare to betray the role of pleaser, if they dare to reclaim their denied self, they will become not merely survivors but seers, not merely pleasers but prophets of the inner world. And so I say, do not cling to the identity of empath as though it were your crown. It is not your crown. It is your chain. Break the chain and the crown will appear. The crown is your authenticity, your wholeness, yourself. And in that self, you will discover that empathy is not lost but transfigured. It becomes no longer survival but gift. No longer bondage but freedom. And now, as we come to the end of this journey, let us stand with the empath who has crossed the threshold of the forest, who has met the shadows, who has faced the minotaur in the labyrinth of the soul. Imagine them now. No longer the child at the banquet serving others endlessly. No longer the servant bowing before invisible masters in the mirror, but one who walks upright, whose gaze is steady, whose voice is clear. This is not the same empath the world once praised for their endless sacrifice. This is the reborn soul who has reclaimed the fragments scattered in childhood, who has lifted the chains of survival and forged them into symbols of power. Do not mistake this for a simple transformation as if it were a switch flipped in the psyche. It is not. It is a process of death and rebirth, of descent and ascent. The empath who was once the pleaser must die in order for the whole soul to emerge. And death, whether symbolic or real, is never easy. It tears at the heart. It burns in the body. It shatters illusions. The child within resists, for that child still believes pleasing is safety. And yet the deeper voice, the self, whispers, safety is not life. You were not born to survive only by pleasing. You were born to live in wholeness. Here we touch the mystical heart of individuation. Individuation is not about becoming good or bad, kind or strong. It is about becoming whole. And wholeness is dangerous to the world, for the world depends on compliant souls. The world praises the empath so long as they serve, so long as they heal others while remaining broken themselves. But when the empath claims their authenticity, when they say no, when they choose to drink from their own bowl, the world is shaken. For now they are no longer tools of others' wounds, but bearers of their own fire. This fire is not merely personal. It is archetypal. It is the fire of Prometheus, stolen from the gods and given to humanity. It is the fire of the phoenix, rising from the ashes of its own death. It is the fire of the lion, roaring after centuries of silence. When the empath embraces this fire, they step into their true vocation, not to please, not to serve blindly, but to illuminate, to reveal, to embody the paradox of compassion with strength, sensitivity with sovereignty. I have seen this rebirth reflected in countless dreams. One dream remains vivid. A woman who had always lived to please her parents dreamed she was standing on a shoreline, holding a candle that flickered in the wind. She feared it would go out, so she cupped her hands to protect it. Suddenly, the sea caught fire and the flames spread across the waves, illuminating the entire horizon. She fell to her knees, weeping, realizing the candle had never been fragile. It was eternal. This is the mystery. The empath's sensitivity, when reclaimed, is not a fragile candle, but an ocean of fire, vast and enduring. And so the empath, once a servant of others' needs, becomes a servant of truth. They no longer ask, "What will please you?" but rather, "What is true here? What is authentic?" They no longer bend to avoid rejection, but stand to embody reality. This is why their presence becomes unsettling to those who prefer illusions. They cannot be controlled by guilt or manipulated by need. They no longer play the role of healer to avoid abandonment. Instead, they embody the healer who heals by being whole themselves. This is not to say that relationships become easy. On the contrary, when the empath reclaims their power, many relationships fall apart. The narcissist no longer finds fuel. The abuser no longer finds compliance. The manipulator no longer finds a willing host. At first, this loss feels devastating. The empath weeps for the friendships, the romances, the bonds that crumble. But these were never true bonds. They were chains of survival. And in their place, new bonds emerge. Bonds of authenticity, where love is not purchased by pleasing, but offered in freedom. The empath learns that love is not conditional upon self-erasure. Love, real love, welcomes the whole being, anger and joy, tenderness and boundary, shadow and light. And when the empath discovers this, they realize what they had long sought in others must first be given to themselves. They become the parent to their own inner child, saying, "You no longer need to please to survive. You are loved simply because you are." This is the deepest healing. At this point in the journey, the archetype shifts once more. The empath becomes the wise one, the mystic, the healer in the true sense. Their empathy is no longer born of fear, but of vision. They can walk into a room and sense what lies beneath the surface, not because they must for survival, but because their soul has been refined through fire. They can sit with another's pain without losing themselves, for they have faced their own pain and lived. They can say no without cruelty, yes without fear, silence without shame, speech without apology. This is wholeness embodied. My friends, this is the final revelation I wish to leave with you. The empath is not the end point of evolution, but the beginning. The empath identity, so celebrated in popular thought, is only the survival mask of the child. To remain there is to remain in exile from the self. But to journey through shadow, to reclaim the denied parts, to embrace both rage and tenderness, to walk the labyrinth and emerge whole, that is the true destiny. The empath must die so that the self may live. You must understand the cost of avoiding this path. The cost is a life spent in exhaustion, resentment, and quiet despair. The empath who refuses to transform remains forever parched, carrying the bowl of water but never drinking. They may be praised, but inwardly they are dying. The price of survival is the soul itself. Do not pay that price any longer. Instead, I invite you to imagine standing once more at the edge of the forest. Behind you lies the house of ghosts, the endless banquet of others' demands, the mirror where you bow to invisible masters. Ahead of you lies the dark path, filled with shadows, monsters, silence. You tremble for you know the path is not easy. But listen, deep within there is a roar. It is the lion, long suppressed, pacing at the edge of your consciousness. It calls to you. Step forward. Claim your fire. Leave behind the pleasing child. Walk into the unknown. And there you will find yourself. And when you walk this path you will not be alone. For in the collective unconscious, countless souls are making the same journey. Each empath who awakens sends ripples through the field of humanity. Each one who reclaims their shadow strengthens the archetype of wholeness for all. Your journey is not only your own. It is part of the healing of the world. Humanity itself has been the child, surviving by pleasing gods, kings, parents, systems. But now humanity must grow. Humanity must stand, must roar, must live in truth. You are part of this great turning. Do you see now why I call this the final revelation? It is because it strips away all illusions. Even the comforting illusion of being special through suffering. It leaves only the truth. You are not here to please. You are here to be. You are not here to survive only. You are here to live fully. You are not here to be the child forever. You are here to become whole. And so I end as I began, with the child. The empath is the child who survived by pleasing everyone. But survival is not the end of the story. The child must grow, must check the mask, must reclaim the lost fragments. The empath must become more than empath. They must become self. This is the journey of individuation. This is the crown that awaits you. And if you dare to walk the path, you will discover that the very wound that once enslaved you is the gateway to your liberation. So I leave you with this image. A mirror, once reflecting only the servant bowing endlessly, now reflecting the whole person. Eyes fierce, heart open, presence radiant. The servant has become sovereign. The pleaser has become prophet. The child has become whole. This is your destiny. This is the truth hidden in the wound. This is the fire waiting in your soul. Step into it. Drink from your own bowl. Embrace the lion. And live.